What is going on, guys? It's Hunter with LS Lures here, and today we're going to be talking about 5 ways you can get better at jig fishing. The first reason you're not getting as many bites as you should be is you're throwing the wrong size. Now, I like to think of jigs in 3 different size categories. I know there's a million different sizes, but for the sake of flipping pitching, all general fishing today, we're going to be talking about 1/4 ounce, 3/8, and half. Why I like to throw them, when I throw them, whatnot. Starting off with 1/4, I throw a 1/4 ounce jig all the time. I know a lot of guys don't like to. I know a lot of guys glue a 1/2 ounce jig in their hand all year round. That's fine, but sometimes it's not fine, and there's a reason you can get a lot more bites throwing a lighter jig. And that is because that lighter jig falls a lot slower, it looks a lot more natural, and it performs better in super shallow water. So if the fish are on the bank, they're around docks, they're getting beat up by guys that are flipping that 1/2 ounce jig or whatever. If they're on the bank, I can flip that 1/4 ounce jig. I'm gonna get snagged less because it's lighter. It floats around a little bit easier. So if there's rocks, wood, sticks, and stuff like that, there's a lot less of a chance that that 1/4 ounce jig is gonna wedge itself into any of those. Less snags means more casts, which means you're not blowing your boat up in there trying to get it out and spooking fish. You can be quieter, you're gonna get more bites. Second thing with that is that 1/4 ounce jig, like I said, it falls a lot slower. So when every other jig is shooting past their face, it looks like really quick and they've seen it a million times, sometimes that'll spook fish off. They don't want anything to do with it. That 1/4 ounce jig, especially when you're shallow, falls nice and slow. It presents something just a little bit different. You can put some kind of like chunk trailer, something really natural that doesn't have a whole lot of kick to it, and you can pick off a lot more fish behind guys, around guys, or on those pressured fish that they don't want a big splash, they don't want a jig that's going super fast. It doesn't sink down into the silt if you're fishing around silty bottom quite as much, so you're gonna get more bites. It's a lot more natural, and it doesn't spook fish off as easily. Another nice thing about a 1/4 ounce jig is you can swim it really easy, but it floats in the water almost when you're popping it along, whereas a 3/8 and a 1/2 ounce, you gotta be moving it real quick. That 1/4 ounce worth the drag of the skirt, and if you put the right trailer on it, it drags along. So if you do want to swim it around and whatnot, it's going to float over that grass. It's not going to want to wedge down. It doesn't fall quite as quick. So that's another really good way to get a lot of bites there. One last thing too about fishing a 1/4 ounce jig is everything I've said so far has been from the mindset of fishing from a boat. If you guys are bank beaters, which there's nothing wrong with that at all, fishing from the bank is a great way to catch a ton of fish and catch some sneaky fish that I can't get to in a boat and fish areas that I can't fish with a boat. But if you guys are fishing from the bank, another thing too is a 1/4 ounce jig should be your best friend because it's light, it doesn't get snagged as much, and most of the time generally fishing from the bank, you're fishing the shallow side of the water, right? You're not fishing 20 plus feet, you're not fishing 10 plus feet most of the time, and most of the fish that you're targeting are in 5 foot of water or less, right? So if you're fishing up there, one thing that I always like to do is when I walk up to a good spot or walk up to the spot I'm gonna be fishing, with that 1/4 ounce jig, I will always flip the immediate area around my feet because you'd be surprised at how many fish are right here, and then slowly fan my way out, working down the banks, because if the first thing I do is put a heavy jig on and I'm dragging around, I'm gonna get snagged immediately because it's heavy and it wedges in. I'm gonna be pissed, I'm gonna stop throwing a jig. Secondly, if I make a bomb cast down the bank first thing, and there's 10 fish in between me and that cast, right? And I catch the fish on the very outside and drag him all the way through all those other fish, odds are I'm not going to catch as many of them now because that fish screaming, not screaming, but shaking his head, causing all that commotion is going to scare a couple of them off. You know, if you're fishing a loaded farm pond, great, there's a million of them, you're going to catch a bunch. But if you're in a pressured city lake like most of us are, if I make that cast and I catch one, I spook everything in between me and that fish away, I'm not going to catch as many fish. But if I catch the one immediately in front of me and then work my way out and catch that one and then that one and that one, I'm not dragging those fish past anything other than empty space. So I'm going to catch a lot more. I'm not going to get snagged as much because I'm fishing a 1/4 ounce, and a 1/4 ounce is just a really natural presentation to A, pick up a bunch of bites, B, everyone on a boat's going to be flipping something a little bit heavier if they can get away with it. And that 1/4 ounce jig's just a really good way to clean up. You can swim it, you can flip it, you can drag it, you can do whatever. You're not going to get snagged as much, and it's a perfect bank fishing bait because it just works. So if you're not throwing it and you bank fish a ton, pick up some 1/4 ounce flipping jigs on the website and you're going to absolutely love them. Moving on to 3/8 of an ounce. A 3/8 ounce jig is my bread and butter. I throw this all year round. It's what I normally have on the deck because it works from 6 inches of water all the way out to 10 plus feet. And it just depends on the situation and what the fish want, right? You can flip it just fine. It'll work in all situations. It doesn't have a super quick fall rate, but it's faster than a quarter ounce. So if you're fishing a little bit deeper, or they'll eat it, right? I always like to go with the heaviest jig I can get away with because A, it hits the bottom quicker. It's less time that I'm waiting on the jig to fall. And if they'll eat it, it's just more efficient for me on the water to flip something heavier that hits the bottom as long as they're biting it, right? If they're not biting a 3/8, I'll downsize to that quarter and we'll see about that. And sometimes you have to jump up just to get the reaction bite, but we'll talk about that with the 1/2 ounce jig, okay? The 3/8 though is the best do-all. You can flip it shallow, you can flip it deeper, you just have to let it fall. It's got a slower fall rate when it's down on the bottom than a 1/2 ounce does, which sometimes is very good. And then also if you're fishing any kind of vertical cover, typically I like to start with a 1/2 ounce just because it gets down quicker and it gets that reaction bite. But if they're not eating that and I know they're around, I'll downsize to that 3/8. It falls just a little bit slower, so if you're flipping standing timber, dock poles, whatever it may be, that 3/8 sometimes is just a little bit slower. You put a big flap and trailer on it, it'll get more bites than that 1/2 ounce will, when sometimes they won't touch that 1/2 ounce at all. So 3/8 should be your bread and butter for all year round. It's what I like to glue in my hand. It gets a ton of bites, and like I said, a lot of boys love gluing a 1/2 ounce jig in their hand. That 3/8 is going to pick up just a couple more bites for you. Moving on to the 1/2 ounce, or a 1/2 ounce, like I said, is most old boys' bread and butter, okay? You glue it in your hand, it falls fast, you don't have to wait around for stuff, and you can fish much deeper water because that bait gets down real quick, right? A 1/2 ounce jig is really good for getting reaction bites, and I like to fish it a lot more in warmer water. Where a 3/8 ounce jig I feel like does better in colder water just because it's slower, it doesn't hit the bottom, it's not as jerky. A 1/2 ounce jig is almost always what I'm throwing when the water gets real warm. It's summertime just because those fish are more active. It forces that reaction bite. You can really get that jig to come up off the bottom and fall fast at the same point in time. And when you're flipping, it shoots past their face. They don't have any time to think about if they're going to eat it or not. So sometimes, if the bite also gets really tough and the 1/4 ounce jig isn't working, sometimes you can upsize to a 1/2 ounce, a 5/8, a 3/4, whatnot, and get those fish to react just because it shoots by so quick. They don't really have a choice of, well, I don't know if I want to eat it or not. It's, I need to eat it right now. I'll at least grab it with my mouth and we'll find out if I want to, right? So by then you've already hooked him and you're dragging him back to the boat. So a 1/2 ounce jig is really good for fishing water and 7 to 8 feet or getting a reaction strike when they're like looking for that fast moving bait. Put a bait that kicks on the back really loud. And then also if you're dragging deeper or you're flipping really deep wood, you know, I don't want to wait for a 1/4 ounce jig to fall all day in a tree that's in 15 feet of water, right? You're gonna be sitting there stripping line and just waiting as that thing kind of floats down the base. Sometimes that's great. Most of the time I'll put that 1/2 ounce jig on there, watch it shoot down to the bottom, shake it a couple times, reel it in. So it's a lot more efficient to flip a 1/2 ounce than some of the other ones, but just know that you don't always have to have a 1/2 ounce jig glued in your hands. Try the quarters, try the 3/8 when you're up shallower, when you're around some fish that have been thumped and have seen a million 1/2 ounce black and blue jigs, and I guarantee you will get more bites this year. Reason number 2 why you are not getting as many bites as you should be on a jig is you are not trimming your screw-up. Every single jig that I get, I take it out, I trim the weed guard, and I hack on the skirt. You know, all of us have that favorite crankbait or topwater that has been absolutely beat to piss. It's got hook rash on it, it's got chunks taken out of the bait, it looks horrible. But for whatever reason, it seems to be getting more bites than the other crankbaits. It always works, and that is because it looks beat up. Fish like eating stuff that's injured, they like eating stuff that looks like it's messed up. And if your jig looks brand spanking new out of the package, it's got a nice full skirt, it looks really pretty, it's got this big weed guard on it, it doesn't look beat up, and it looks like every other jig that every Joe Schmo off the whatever came from Walmart, didn't touch it, tied it on, and threw it out there. It looks like the exact same jig. So by taking a pair of scissors, hacking on the skirt, beating it up, making it look a little uneven, a little kind of messed up, that makes all of your different skirt strands flare in different ways. Your shorter ones are going to flare more, your longer ones are going to take more time. So every time you twitch that jig, you've got varying rates of action there, and it moves a lot quicker with those shorter ones. B, it presents your trailer a lot better too. So if I've got a full skirt on there and I've got my trailer on the back, unless my trailer is huge and goes way past the skirt, that skirt's going to dull the motion of my trailer. If I cut it up more towards the hook, make it look more uneven, it gives that trailer all the motion in the world to do whatever it needs to. That was a really good, hand action there for our trailer. But either way, it doesn't matter. By trimming it up, by trimming that weed guard down, that weed guard is a big bulky thing. Cut it down, you don't need the whole thing, okay? Make it look a little bit more compact, make your jig look beat up, and you're gonna get more bites just because it's different, okay? And there's a million different ways you can trim this. There's a ton of different ways you can make your jig look completely different for different scenarios. And sometimes you want a full skirt, but most of the year and most of the time there's enough guys throwing jigs with full skirts that I like to trim mine down, get more bites, and I've won a lot of money doing it. So we'll do a separate video breaking down all the different ways I like to trim it up and why and how and what trailers I pair up with it. But trim your skirts, you will catch more fish. The second thing is you're throwing the wrong trailers on it. You don't have to throw a full-size trailer on the back of a jig. I know most of you don't, but some of you do, and sometimes that's fine, right? But a lot of times you want that trailer to look absolutely natural on the back of this, which means you don't have to throw a full-size rage craw. Trim it up, cut it back, make sure that the appendages are getting just past that skirt once it's trimmed, so that way they've got full range of motion, but they're not completely off the back, right? If we're trimming the skirt, we don't have to put a full-size trailer on there. We can make it a lot more compact, we can make it look a lot better, while it's also looking a lot more beat up, and you're just gonna get more bites. So we can make a whole video on trailers. Just know that you don't have to put the whole thing on there. Put something with action, put something with no action. It doesn't really matter. Just make sure that that trailer is visible and it's not getting dulled out by your skirt. The third reason you're not getting as many bites as you should be on a jig is you're throwing the wrong colors. I understand that fishing's a weird sport. Sometimes they eat exactly what they should be. Sometimes they eat the opposite of what they should be. Sometimes it makes a difference. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't at all. You can throw anything out there and they'll eat it. But I like to stick to a couple just golden rules when it comes to colors that always seem to get me bites, that make a lot of sense to me, and that I feel like work good for the fish. And if things get weird, I fall back to my weird options, and typically that'll pick them up. But throw natural colors in clean water and darker, brighter colors in dirty water. That is because when those fish are out and about and they've got really good visibility, they can see your jig really well. So while they may eat black and blue on some days in gin clear water, great, do it. But if you're not getting bit and you're throwing black and blue in 8-foot water clarity, there's a reason, okay? Those fish know that it's not real, they've seen it before. Pressured fish especially get a lot more finicky about that stuff, so throw your naturals, that's green pumpkin, your green pumpkin blues, anything that's more translucent like our color Riddler is a great clean water color, and that is because it looks like the forage that the fish are eating. So when the fish are feeding on those bluegill in clean water, those bluegill are very natural looking, right? I mean, it matches the hatch, it doesn't look like something that's really odd, and if they can get that much better of a look at it, you want it to look like what they're eating, like the craws, like the bluegill and stuff like that, which is very natural. When it comes to dirty water, throw your black and blues in your really dark colors and throw your really bright ones. That is because they silhouette a lot better. If you put a black and blue jig in dirty water and you put a green pumpkin jig in dirty water, that black and blue stands out a lot more because it's got a much greater presence and a much darker silhouette. So they can see it, they can see the outline a lot better. I'm not saying don't throw green pumpkin in there. You can, it does work from time to time. I like throwing green pumpkin and a darker trailer in muddy water when the sun's really bright because I think there's more light penetration. And I think if everyone's throwing black and blue and I throw a really dark natural, sometimes I get more bites doing that. But again, colors are weird. We're sticking to the general concepts here. So if you're fishing clear water, throw natural colors, throw your green pumpkins because those fish can see it. They do know what's going on, right? Not always, but sometimes. And if you want to get more bites, generally speaking, throw natural colors in clean water and throw your really dark or your really bright colors in dirty water. Stained water, play around with it a little bit. You know, it just depends on what they're looking for. Let the fish tell you what they want. Start with something more natural, work a little bit darker. It doesn't take that long, especially if you know there's fish in the area, to really key in on exactly what they're looking for. The fourth reason you probably hate fishing jigs is you're throwing them on the wrong setup. Jigs have a brush guard, jigs have a really heavy hook, and unless you're throwing some kind of Ned jig, or something with a really light wire hook, you're probably not throwing it on the right setup, which is very frustrating at times because you're losing fish, you can't seem to pin them right, you're not hooking them at all, they're coming off, they're wrapping you up, and that is because you're not throwing heavy enough setup. When I started, I was throwing jigs on like a 6'6", medium heavy maybe, with like 12-pound fluorocarbon, and could not figure out why I was losing so many fish, why things weren't going right, why I was missing a bunch of bites, like you name it. I had every problem in the beginning. Now I almost religiously throw a jig on a 7.6 heavy, 7.4 heavy, 7.3 heavy, something heavy, Unless it's a lighter jig or a lighter brush guard, I'll throw it on a medium heavy. You can get away with that if you just really crack them. And I throw everything on 17 to 20 pound fluorocarbon. Very rarely do I run 15 unless things get really tough. But like, I live with 20 pound fluorocarbon in my hand, and that is because it doesn't stretch, it's not gonna break, and with a heavy rod like that, you can really drive it home. Because if you think about it, when you set the hook on those fish, and this has to come out of their mouth, this brush guard has to collapse down enough to let that hook come out, right? So if I half-heartedly set the hook and I've got a soft rod and I've got stretchy 12-pound fluorocarbon, when I light-heartedly swing, or even if I swing really hard, that line has a ton of stretch, which means that this isn't just going straight up into it, and that is barely going to collapse. You're barely going to nick them. They're going to shake their head and they're going to come off. Where if I have really heavy fluorocarbon that doesn't have as much stretch and a rod that can absolutely put the fear of God into them, this is going to come straight down and that hook is going to go through their freaking brain and they're not coming off. So if you're losing fish, or if you don't feel comfortable throwing a jig period, invest in a rod that's at least 7'3" to 7'6" and is a heavy action. If you're throwing 1/4 ounce to 3/8 ounce jigs, you can get away with a medium heavy that's 7'1" to 7'6", and that's fine, but just know that you should be throwing heavier fluorocarbon on it and you need to crack them. You need to crack them good. So that's going to save you a lot of frustration. It's going to save you a lot of heartbreak. A lot of guys get worried about line shyness, and if you're catching them out of the really heavy stuff, most of the time they're not looking for line anyway. You know, when you're pitching a jig around, they're not seeing the jig and then looking at the line. They see the jig, they eat the jig. That's that. You know, we're not fishing any of the northern lakes where they can see everything for a country mile around them. So if you throw anything lighter or anything heavier than 8-pound fluorocarbon, they're gonna know, right? No, we're flipping bushes, we're dragging jigs in dirty water. Like, throw the heaviest line you can get away with and you're gonna lose a lot less fish. You're gonna catch a lot more big fish, and you're gonna stop wasting your time and getting frustrated and absolutely hating jigs, because it's not the jig's fault. You just need a better setup. Last but not least, guys, reason number 5 why you're not catching as many fish on a jig as you should is you're not fishing a jig enough. Jigs are a very complex but not complex bait at the same time. You can make them as complicated or as not complicated as you want. It's not rocket science though. You know, if you go out and you throw a brown jig with a brown trailer that looks like a crawdad and you drag it around rocks, you're going to get bites, okay? You can make it as complicated to where it's got 3 strands of orange and a lighter underbelly. You can make it super complicated if you want, but it's not rocket science, okay? Put it in your hand, figure out all those little nuances, fish it all year round, and just know that every time you go out, you're going to have it on the deck, because there's always a jig bite. There's always a way to catch them on a jig, whether it's swimming it, whether it's in 20 feet of water, or 6 inches, or 7 feet, or on wood, or on rock, or on metal, whatever it may be. There's always a jig bite somewhere. And if you guys really want to get good at it, you have to lock it in your hand. You have to fish it a ton, because every time I'm out, my confidence bait is a jig now. And it doesn't matter what lake I'm at, because I know every way that I can fish that jig or work that jig, or what sizes I need to fish around certain types of cover to get those fish to trigger. And I know that wherever I go in the country, that I can have 5 or 6 of my favorite jigs in a box and go catch fish wherever with them. So if you want to get better at fishing a jig, you have to fish a jig. I know it's a lot of fun to go out and throw a Senko and a Ned rig and all those things, and that's great. And if you want to just do that, do that. But if you want to get better at a jig, it's going to take time, and you have to understand that when you're fishing it, you got to fish it, right? Like, it's not a make 5 casts with it. It's let's break this lake down. I know I can catch them somewhere with it. Let's experiment with trailers and colors and sizes. And once you start to dial those things in, and I go from one lake to the next, you can see areas that say, and you can say to yourself, that looks just like that one place I thumped him flipping a jig. You can go there and you can do that, and you can catch them doing it. And then as you learn more places, pretty soon that bait's going to be in your hand all the dang time. And while it's not always the answer, it's always a good way to get a kicker bite, to put a couple fish in the box, to get some confidence. And when things get really bad, the first thing I put in my hand is some kind of lighter jig, because I know I can go anywhere and pluck a couple fish on it. So if you guys are looking to get better at jig fishing, I hope this video helps. I hope some of these tips and tricks are eye-opening. If you know, great, awesome. You love fishing a jig too, I get it, that's perfect. But hopefully for some of you that don't fish a jig as much, share this with your buddies, send this to a couple guys that hate fishing a jig or always harping about fishing a jig, and hopefully this can, you know, knock some sense into them so they can start catching a lot more fish this year. But jigs are great. They always work. There's always a jig bite. We craft confidence here at LS Lures. We're trying to help you guys become better jig fishermen. Find everything on our website, link below, and we'll see you guys next time.